Under the soft glow of the shopping mall's morning lights, Mallory Grace walked quietly through the polished corridors of Belmont Plaza. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon from the nearby pretzel stand and high-end perfume from luxury boutiques that lined the main atrium like a row of jeweled boxes. She didn't belong here, at least not in the way that people around her seemed to define belonging. Dressed in a pale wool coat that had long lost its original shape and wearing flat shoes with just a trace of scuff on the toe, Mallory moved slowly, her hands clutching the frayed handles of a canvas tote bag that seemed heavier than it should have been. Her auburn hair was pinned back in a simple twist, revealing a face both striking and gentle, with green eyes that didn't seek attention but saw everything. Her steps were tentative, not hesitant, but purposeful, as if each one carried the weight of another life she had lived far away from here. She paused near a bench in the central court of the plaza where a decorative fountain bubbled gently, surrounded by artificial ivy and gold-trimmed signage. It was early still, and the place hadn't yet filled with its usual noise. The world here was slick, expensive, curated for people with polished credit cards and time to browse. Mallory was not one of them, but she wasn't here to shop. She scanned the large digital directory with quiet concentration, her brow furrowing slightly. Her eyes drifted toward the second floor, where a modest toy store, Bright Buttons, sat tucked between a boutique candle shop and a designer pet accessory store. In her bag, beside a carefully folded cardigan and a wrapped box, was a small envelope bearing a simple name in block letters. Celia, age 10. She pulled the envelope out for just a moment and looked at it, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the paper. A smile touched her lips, small and barely visible, but real. She whispered something under her breath, perhaps a phrase of reassurance to herself, or a reminder not to cry. A few passers-by glanced at her, then moved on without interest. The moment stretched, quiet and private, until the uniformed woman from mall security approached, her boots clicking sharply against the tiles. "Miss, are you all right?" she asked, polite but clipped, eyes flicking over Mallory's bag and clothing with subtle scrutiny. Mallory turned, nodding quickly. "Yes, thank you. I'm just waiting." Her voice was soft but steady, marked with something that sounded like exhaustion disguised as grace. The officer nodded, but her posture didn't ease. She lingered a second longer before walking away. Mallory sat down slowly on the bench, the bag still clutched in her hands. Her fingers rested protectively over the box inside. She glanced at the upper floor again, exhaled, and waited. Not with impatience, but with quiet resolve, unaware that the next few minutes would unravel her silence in ways she could never have prepared for. It started with a misunderstanding so ordinary that no one, not even Mallory herself, could have predicted how quickly it would slide into something else. Something sharper, more humiliating. She had only stood up for a moment to stretch her legs and readjust the weight of her tote bag when a man in a navy blazer brushed past her near the fountain. His arm accidentally knocked against the edge of her canvas bag, which had slipped slightly from her shoulder, and a wrapped box inside tumbled out, landing on the tile floor with a dull thud. The man turned sharply, annoyed more than injured, and looked down at the package as if it had committed a crime. He picked it up as if it were unclean and held it awkwardly between two fingers, turning to face Mallory with an expression already shaped by judgment. "Is this yours?" he asked sharply, though the tone made it clear he didn't believe she had any right to be here at all. "Yes," Mallory said, stepping forward with one hand out. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to—" But the man didn't hand it to her. Instead, he looked down at the wrapping, plain white paper tied with a piece of twine, the kind used in bakeries or craft stores, and scoffed under his breath. "Selling something?" he muttered, half to himself, half to the approaching security guard who had noticed the minor commotion. "You can't peddle things in here." Mallory blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" Another security guard, a younger man with a radio clipped to his belt, stepped in, asking curtly, "Ma'am, are you distributing anything in the center?" No, Mallory stammered. She could feel her face flushing, a burning warmth creeping up her neck and into her cheeks. "It's a gift for my sister." She reached for the box, now slightly crumpled at one edge, but the guard didn't return it immediately. "Do you work in this mall?" "No." "Are you affiliated with any of the stores here?" "No," she repeated, a little louder now, her voice still soft but rising slightly in tension. "I'm just here to see someone." More people had begun to notice the interaction. A few turned their heads. Some slowed their pace, curious. Mallory could feel their eyes on her, not out of sympathy, but suspicion, like onlookers at a minor accident. "She's not with any vendor," the first guard said into his radio. "Possible solicitation. We've had issues lately." Mallory stepped back instinctively, overwhelmed by the abrupt shift in energy. "I'm not selling anything," she said. Firmer now, the words trembling more from disbelief than fear. "It's just a personal visit. I'm not doing anything wrong." "Then maybe you can explain why you're sitting in the main court, handing out packages?" the man in the blazer asked sarcastically, crossing his arms. "I dropped it," she said again, quieter this time. But by then, the two security officers had positioned themselves on either side of her. "We're going to ask you to come with us," one of them said, still holding the box. "You're disrupting the environment here." "I'm not," she whispered, the syllables catching. "Ma'am?" And then, in a gesture so sudden it felt theatrical, one of the guards reached for her arm. Not roughly, not yet, but firm, authoritative. Mallory tried to pull away instinctively, and the resistance prompted an escalation. The guard's grip tightened. Another arm went around her shoulders. Someone's hand tangled momentarily in her hair as she twisted away, trying not to drop her bag. The tote, tugged from her arm in the scuffle, slid to the floor with a soft clatter. Its contents began to spill. A second envelope, this one sealed, a paperback book with underlined notes in the margins, a handmade card, a small plastic container of what appeared to be homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper, and a small, square, worn, leather-bound item, a notebook or journal, its clasp undone. Mallory gasped, wrenching her arm away, her breath catching in the back of her throat. "Please don't touch my things," she said, her voice cracking. "We're not arresting you, ma'am, but you need to come with us until we verify what's going on." "I didn't do anything," she said, her eyes welling now, not from pain but from the sheer absurdity. The speed of how quickly she had gone from silent observer of this place to its presumed problem. Another guard joined them, and someone picked up her bag, hastily shoving the contents back inside. The small leather-bound item remained on the floor, forgotten for now, its corner marked with faded initials. MG, hand-etched. A young woman standing nearby glanced at it and then at Mallory. Her brows pinched slightly, not in judgment, but recognition. Before she could say anything, Mallory had been ushered away, surrounded now by uniforms and silence. The white paper package held like evidence in the crook of a security guard's arm. Upstairs, the toy store door opened, and a girl in a red staff vest stepped out onto the mezzanine to look over the rail. Her name tag read Celia. Her eyes searched the floor below, not yet aware that the woman who had promised to surprise her today was already being led away. The hallway behind the main atrium was a stark contrast to the gleaming mall floors. The back corridor was lined with beige utility walls, low fluorescent lighting, and the faint smell of floor polish and recycled air. Mallory's footsteps echoed between the dull plaster as she was escorted by two guards, one in front, one behind, toward a small administrative office near the staff elevators. She didn't resist, didn't speak. Her body had gone still, her mouth drawn in a thin line, and the embarrassment that had flushed her cheeks before had begun to harden into something colder, something that settled into her stomach like a stone. The package she had carried so carefully was now slightly bent at the corner, the twine stretched and off-center. One of the guards held it like an obligation, not bothering to adjust the shape or make it presentable again. It looked like garbage now, like an unwanted flyer someone handed out on a subway platform. Inside the small office, Mallory was asked to sit. The room was cramped, with laminated wood furniture and an old desktop computer humming in the corner. There was no window. The door clicked closed behind her with an unmistakable finality. One of the guards remained by the door, the other sat across from her with a clipboard. He asked her to provide identification, and she did so without hesitation. She pulled her driver's license from the inner pocket of her wallet and slid it across the table. Her hands were shaking. He studied it briefly, then scribbled something on a form. "What brings you here today?" he asked without looking up. "I told the other man. I came to surprise my little sister." "She works at the toy store upstairs," Mallory said, her voice low, dry now. "Today's her birthday." "And the package?" "It's a gift. I made it." Made it? Mallory hesitated. She wasn't in the habit of explaining herself. Most people she met professionally didn't require stories or background. They respected credentials, citations, results. But here, in this blank little room with its humming fluorescent bulb and formality of suspicion, it was her voice alone that would matter. "It's a globe," she said at last. "A kinetic sculpture. I carved it, assembled the internal components, programmed the motor to rotate in relation to ambient temperature and light. It was part of a prototype I developed last year, and Celia, my sister, she loved it. She asked me to teach her how to make one. I was going to give it to her today, as a surprise." The guard blinked at her. Either he didn't understand what she'd just said, or he didn't care. He looked down at the paper in his hand again. "You work where?" Mallory hesitated again. "Massachusetts Institute of Technology," she said quietly. "Mechanical systems and applied robotics." That made him pause. He looked at her again, more directly, as if noticing, for the first time, something in her posture or tone that didn't fit the image they'd formed of her moments ago. But the moment was fleeting. His expression settled back into neutrality. "Is there someone who can verify this?" Mallory frowned slightly. "Verify? What exactly?" "That you're not here distributing materials or conducting unauthorized activity in the mall." "I'm not, and I shouldn't have to prove that to you. I was sitting on a bench with a gift." He nodded, unimpressed. "Do you know how it looked to others?" Mallory blinked, unsure how to answer. "I don't think sitting quietly with a box should be alarming." He didn't respond, only made another note on his paper. The silence in the room stretched. Meanwhile, outside that office, the small crowd that had gathered earlier in the atrium had mostly dispersed, though two older women still lingered near the fountain. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Helen Myers, had watched the entire incident with a discomfort that refused to leave her chest. The way the young woman had been pulled by the arm, the confused panic in her face. It reminded Helen too closely of things she'd seen before, decades earlier in less polished places. She didn't know the girl's story, but she knew the look of a person being dismissed by a system too lazy to listen. Back inside the office, the guard had left briefly to verify details, leaving Mallory alone in the silence. She rubbed her hands together, breathing deeply. A part of her wanted to cry, not from fear, but from a rising humiliation that had wrapped itself tightly around her. This was not supposed to happen today. She had taken time off, postponed a lab meeting, worked into the night to finish the final touches on the gift. She had even worn a coat her sister liked, just to make her smile. She stood slowly and retrieved her bag from the floor. As she moved, the leather-bound notebook that had fallen earlier slid slightly from between other items. She caught it and hesitated, then opened it to the bookmarked page. Inside, a sketch of the globe design. Fine lines, tight notation, lines of code scribbled in pencil. In the margin, a sentence. For Celia, who never stops asking why. She stared at it for a long moment, her eyes dry but full of something deeper than tears. The door opened again, and the same security officer stepped back inside, a younger mall employee behind him. The employee, barely 20, glanced between Mallory and the guard, holding something in his hands. Her credentials badge, left unknowingly in the outer sleeve of her tote. "She's telling the truth," he said, awkward but certain. "I checked the badge ID online, and I also found this." He held up a crumpled brochure, the MIT open house flyer that had been folded beside her book. Her name was listed as one of the guest speakers for a hands-on seminar. The security guard looked at it, then back at Mallory. There was a pause, brief but weighted. Mallory didn't flinch. She only said, "May I go now?" The guard said nothing, then finally, "You're free to leave. Sorry for the inconvenience." She nodded once. No sarcasm, no anger, only fatigue. She took the box, checked the contents quickly, her hands moving with practiced care, and without another word, walked toward the door. As she stepped out of the hallway and back into the mall's main corridor, the world seemed louder, faster, more artificial. The light was too bright, the floor too clean, the people too indifferent. But upstairs, on the mezzanine, a familiar face had appeared. Celia searching the lower floor, her eyes scanning for someone she had already feared might not come. Mallory exhaled, tightened her grip on the box, and started walking. By the time Mallory reached the second floor, the stiffness in her shoulders had settled into something deeper, a quiet heaviness that she carried without showing it on her face. The incident downstairs lingered at the edge of her thoughts like a dull bruise, unspoken but present, coloring the edges of everything. She moved with composed determination now, as if reclaiming something that had been taken from her, not in the physical sense, but in a more private, more intimate way. She no longer walked as a guest in a space not meant for her. She walked like someone who had endured a humiliation and refused to let it define the outcome of her day. The escalator released her onto the mezzanine with a soft, mechanical whir. Her eyes swept across the corridor until they settled on the modest storefront of Bright Buttons, the toy shop where her sister Celia worked. The window display was bright and cheerful, filled with plush animals, science kits, and old-fashioned wooden toys that looked handcrafted. There was a garland of construction paper stars draped along the inside of the window, clearly made by a child's hand. Tucked among them was a small white card that read, in colorful marker, "Happy birthday, Celia." Mallory paused in front of the glass for a moment, catching her reflection. She didn't linger. Her reflection wasn't what interested her. It was the simple sight of her sister inside, behind the counter, speaking earnestly to a mother and child, helping the little boy pick between two books. Celia's smile was warm and open, and her gestures animated. There was no trace of the worry or shyness Mallory had seen in her as a child. In this space, she looked like she belonged. That thought made Mallory smile, softly without drawing attention to herself, as she took the wrapped gift from her bag, gently reshaping the ribbon where it had been bent. She stepped into the shop, and the little bell above the door chimed sweetly. Celia turned her head at the sound, her expression changing in an instant from polite attentiveness to startled delight. "Mallory?" she said, incredulous. "What, you're here? I thought you said next week." "I changed my mind," Mallory replied, her voice calm but touched with warmth. "Some things shouldn't wait." Celia came around the counter, her arms already outstretched. She was still in her red store vest, her curly brown hair pulled up into a bun that had started to unravel over the course of the day. She hugged her sister tightly, then pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. "I can't believe you came," she said. "You hate malls." "I still do," Mallory replied, "but I couldn't miss today." She held out the package. Celia took it with both hands, looking down at it as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. "You made this?" she asked. Mallory nodded. "It's the one we talked about, the globe. The small version. The motor responds to heat and light levels. It runs on ambient energy. You can put it by your window." Celia bit her lower lip, blinking too quickly. "You finished it?" she whispered. "Even after everything you've been dealing with?" "Yes, I needed to." "You earned it. You deserve it." Before Celia could say anything more, a woman entered the shop, one of the older customers who had witnessed the incident in the atrium earlier. Her expression was hesitant but purposeful. She walked slowly past the shelves, pretending to browse, but her eyes remained on the sisters. Mallory noticed her, and for a brief moment their eyes met. The woman gave the slightest nod, a gesture of recognition. Not of fame, not of admiration, but of quiet solidarity. The way women who have known humiliation and dignity in equal measure acknowledge one another without words. Mallory returned the nod, then turned back to her sister. "Let's open it," Celia said, pulling gently at the twine. She unwrapped the paper carefully, revealing a wooden box with a sliding lid. Inside, nestled in soft cotton, was the globe. Smaller than a grapefruit, crafted of dark walnut and inlaid with brass arcs for continents. A delicate copper filament winding through its center. As Celia touched it, the globe stirred slightly, then began to rotate, slowly and silently. A tiny light glowed at its axis, flickering gently like a heartbeat. Celia stared at it, speechless. "Mallory, this is beautiful." "I designed it for you," Mallory said. "I wanted you to know that the world still turns, even when we think we've stopped moving. And it will keep turning. For you." There was a long pause, the kind that doesn't ask to be filled, the kind where nothing needs to be said because the moment itself is whole. In the background, the soft hum of the mall continued. Children's laughter floated in from the corridor. But in this quiet pocket of space, two sisters stood together, and the truth of their bond was more solid than anything money or power could ever offer. Celia closed the lid gently and wrapped her arms around Mallory again. This time, she didn't let go so quickly. When she finally stepped back, she said, "I want to show it to everyone." "You don't have to," Mallory replied. "It's enough if you just remember." But Celia shook her head. "No, you're the one who taught me how to build. You taught me how to question things, how to fix what's broken. I want people to see what that looks like. And it looks like this." In that moment, something inside Mallory softened. Not completely. She would always carry the weight of being misunderstood by strangers, of being misread, underestimated. But she would also carry this: the pride in her sister's eyes, the knowledge that she had given her something no one could take away. It was not a gift of money or status, but of craft, purpose, and care. And that perhaps was why it mattered so much. The peace that had briefly settled over Mallory began to shift the moment she and Celia stepped outside the toy shop together. Celia still cradled the wooden box in her arms like a sacred object, a mixture of pride and awe glowing on her face. And Mallory walked beside her, hands in the pockets of her coat, shoulders slightly hunched, but her pace steady. She wasn't thinking of the earlier encounter. She had pushed it aside, compartmentalized it as she had done with countless other slights and misunderstandings over the years. What mattered now was that her sister had her gift, that the moment they shared had not been stolen. But as they moved back toward the mezzanine rail, intending to sit on a nearby bench and talk a little longer before parting ways, she noticed something strange. Two mall security officers were standing together near the upper-level cafe, one of whom she recognized from earlier. Their heads turned slightly as she approached, and one of them spoke into a shoulder-mounted radio, low but audible. Mallory didn't change her expression, but her pace slowed by a fraction. Celia didn't notice. She was saying something about showing the globe to her supervisor and setting it up in the display window, but Mallory only half heard her. She felt that creeping, nauseating sense again. That sense of being watched not with curiosity, but with protocol, of being reduced to a profile, a situation, a category. When they reached the bench, Celia sat and carefully opened the box again to demonstrate the mechanism, gently coaxing the globe to begin its rotation. The tiny copper filament lit softly, just as before, catching the light from the skylight above. Mallory stayed standing, her eyes flicking toward the guards, then back to her sister, then toward the escalator. She was calculating something, though she didn't quite know what. Maybe how quickly she could leave before being stopped again, or whether she was imagining the whole thing. But then, without warning, a third uniformed figure approached them from the side. A different guard, older, with a clipboard in one hand and a neutral expression. He didn't greet them. He simply stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said, looking directly at Mallory, "we've been asked to request that you return briefly to the management office for follow-up." Celia looked up in confusion. "What for?" "It's a procedural matter," the guard replied. "A discrepancy was reported with her identification." Mallory didn't move. "I've already spoken with security," she said calmly. "I was cleared and allowed to leave. I'm not returning unless there's a legal reason for detaining me." The guard's face remained impassive. "This won't take long. We'd just like to confirm some additional details." Celia stood up now, her voice sharper. "This is ridiculous. She's not doing anything wrong. She was already harassed once and you're doing it again?" "Miss," the guard began, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "We're not here to harass anyone. We're just following up on..." "On what?" Mallory interrupted, her voice still low but unmistakably firm. "On someone not liking how I look when I sit quietly in a public space? On me carrying a package in a shopping mall? Or on the fact that I didn't escalate the last time you pulled me out of a seat by force?" A few heads turned. Mallory didn't raise her voice, but there was something in her tone now, steel wrapped in velvet, that made people listen. The first two guards from earlier had begun approaching from the far end of the mezzanine, clearly summoned again. One of them now held a printout, probably some internal report with her name on it, fabricated from the encounter and likely filled with procedural jargon that rendered her a footnote in their daily routine. "You're making a mistake," Celia said, stepping forward protectively. "She's a professor. She builds machines that get published in journals. You've made her feel like a criminal in front of everyone." Mallory placed a hand on her sister's arm. "Don't," she said gently. "They're not interested in who I am. They're interested in maintaining the illusion that they're in control of the space. They made a call too fast, and now they're trying to make the facts fit the narrative." One of the guards flinched slightly, perhaps recognizing the truth in her words, perhaps just unsettled by how easily she dismantled their posturing with language. The older officer stepped forward again. "Ma'am, if you refuse to come voluntarily, we'll have to request mall police assistance." "That won't be necessary," said a voice to the side. Everyone turned. A tall man in a charcoal gray suit had stepped forward from a nearby seating area. He held a tablet in one hand and a leather case in the other. His face was calm, professional, but his eyes were focused and direct. "I'm Robert Fine," he said, addressing the guards. "Mall management's legal liaison. I've just been briefed on this situation, and I'd recommend all involved take a breath and reconsider the optics of what's unfolding here." The guards froze, uncertain. "This woman," he continued, nodding toward Mallory, "was detained earlier based on a misinterpretation. She complied fully, was cleared, and then was released without reprimand or further incident. Yet now I see she's being approached again. In public, in front of a minor, with no new evidence presented. Is that accurate?" The guards looked at each other, no one eager to speak first. The older one finally said, "There was an inconsistency in the follow-up file." "I reviewed the file," Fine replied, raising his tablet. "It was typed by a staff member who wasn't even present during the encounter. If you'd like to escalate this further, we can bring in the plaza's liability officer. But I assure you, if this becomes a civil matter, the narrative won't favor the actions taken today." Mallory stood motionless. She hadn't expected this. Not defense. Not even recognition. She looked at the man, Robert Fine, with a guarded kind of gratitude. Not trust, but acknowledgement. Fine turned to her and spoke in a quieter tone. "Miss Grace, you're under no obligation to follow them anywhere. You've been cleared. You may stay or leave as you wish." Mallory nodded once. "Thank you," she said simply. The guard stepped back. One murmured an apology without meeting her eyes. Mallory turned back to Celia, who was watching all of it with a stunned expression. "Do you want to stay a little longer?" Celia asked tentatively. Mallory shook her head. "No, I think it's enough for today." She took the globe from her sister's hands and placed it gently back in the box, then handed it to her. "You keep it here," she said. "It was made to be in light." And with that, she walked down the mezzanine corridor without urgency, but with a different gravity to her steps. Heavier now, but also more deliberate, as if the ground itself had been reminded that she belonged to it, just as much as anyone else. Mallory didn't speak as she descended the escalator back to the main level. Her hands were tucked into her coat pockets, her eyes calm, unfazed on the surface, but somewhere beneath the careful stillness of her features was a controlled fire that hadn't been there earlier. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. What she felt was closer to exhaustion, a weight that settled between her shoulder blades. Not from the confrontation itself, but from what it had represented. That a simple visit to deliver a gift to her sister could become an interrogation. That her silence had been misread as threat. That her presence, as unassuming as it had been, had triggered not welcome, but control. And yet, as she stepped into the main atrium once more, the very place where the incident had begun, the symmetry struck her. She was back where it started. But she was not the same. The fountain still bubbled in the center, surrounded now by clusters of people finishing their coffee, checking their phones, drifting between stores with weekend ease. Nobody noticed her. That fact no longer stung. It had once, when she was younger, when she wanted to be seen for what she knew, rather than how she looked. But now, after the silence upstairs had been broken by that unexpected voice, by the calm authority of someone who had nothing to gain by intervening, and still chose to name the imbalance, something shifted inside her. She crossed the atrium and found the bench where she'd sat that morning, just as the misunderstanding began. She stood for a moment, looking down at the spot as though it belonged to another version of herself, someone who had walked into the day believing in its simplicity. She sat down slowly, deliberately. Across the open space, the older woman who had been watching from afar earlier, Helen Myers, still holding the same canvas shopping bag from the morning, approached. She didn't say anything at first. She simply sat beside Mallory, not too close, not intrusive. After a pause, she turned her head slightly and offered a small smile. "I was here when they grabbed you," she said, in a voice softened by years and worn by memory. "It was wrong." Mallory looked at her, surprised not by the sentiment but by the timing. Helen continued, "I used to teach high school science. 34 years. I saw girls like you come and go, smart, quiet, polite, and too often, completely dismissed. I suppose it never really changes." Mallory smiled faintly. "Maybe not, but at least this time I had a witness." Helen nodded slowly. "You carry yourself like someone who's used to being underestimated. That's a skill." "I've had practice." Another silence passed between them, companionable this time. The fountain murmured steadily behind them. Mallory looked ahead without speaking for a long moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, leather-bound notebook that had fallen from her bag earlier that day. She opened it to a page near the middle and held it up slightly. "This is where it started," she said softly. "The idea for the globe. I drew it on a napkin first while waiting for Celia to finish a tutoring session. She was 13 and already smarter than most of my students. I knew then that if I didn't find a way to show her the world moves for people like her too, she might grow up thinking she had to apologize for her curiosity." Helen looked at the page, eyes narrowed gently. "Does she know that?" Mallory shook her head. "Not all of it, but today she saw enough." Helen rested her hand over Mallory's for a moment, a gesture full of quiet understanding, not pity. Then she stood, offered a nod, and walked away. Mallory watched her go, feeling no need to stop her or continue the conversation. The gesture was enough. As she rose from the bench, a light breeze stirred through the automatic doors at the entrance, brushing the hem of her coat. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and began walking toward the exit. Not rushed, not defiant, but steady, as though she were walking through the final line of a proof she'd written long ago, one whose conclusion she had always known. Would be hers alone to write. The sunlight had shifted by the time Mallory stepped outside. It was lower now, warmer in hue, casting elongated shadows across the concrete plaza in front of the mall. She stood for a moment just past the automatic doors, her hands relaxed at her sides, her shoulders drawn back ever so slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet certainty. The cool air moved gently across her face. And for the first time all day, she allowed herself to breathe fully. Not with restraint, not through the filter of performance or caution, but simply as herself. She turned to glance back through the glass doors, not at the building, not at the people still moving within it, but at the path she had walked. From the bench to the office, to her sister, to the final moment of stillness. All of it still lingered, and yet none of it clung to her anymore. Mallory made her way slowly toward the bus stop across the parking lot, where a line of trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. She didn't own a car, had never needed one, living as close to campus as she did, but the idea of being driven felt wrong today anyway. Her walk was unhurried, her body loose in motion, like someone emerging from something unnamed and yet utterly transformative. She reached the bench at the stop and sat, resting her bag beside her, careful not to disturb the edge of the notebook peeking out. As she waited, a little girl nearby tugged on her mother's coat and pointed in Mallory's direction. "Mommy, she looks like the lady in the science book," she said, her voice high and wondering. The mother turned, glanced quickly at Mallory, then shook her head with a polite smile. "Just someone waiting for the bus, sweetheart." Mallory didn't react, didn't turn, didn't correct her. She simply lowered her gaze to her hands and let them rest against her knees. The little girl's voice, though, stayed with her. Soft, reverent, without judgment. And for the first time that day, Mallory allowed a smile to surface. Not from pride, but from a deeper place. A place that knew exactly who she was. A place that no longer required validation. Across the street, the glass facade of the mall reflected her outline in the golden light. Just a quiet figure on a bench, dressed in a pale coat, a bit tired, a bit distant, utterly unremarkable to those who only looked. But inside that coat and behind those eyes lived a world of brilliance, kindness, and unshakable clarity. The bus pulled up with a low sigh of brakes. Mallory stood, picked up her bag, and boarded. As the doors closed behind her, the bench emptied, the breeze shifted, and the street resumed its rhythm. But something in the air had changed, not loud. Not visible, but certain. She had arrived as a question. She left as her own answer.